Good morning. We're ready to get started. Most of you probably came for the donuts and you're stuck here, but if you came to study the Bible, then that's great too. But if you came for the donuts, I understand. That's why I came this morning. We're starting chapter 28 this morning. This has been a long time coming, 56 lessons, and we're very close to the end. So we finished chapter 27, and in chapter 27 we read of the death and the burial of Jesus. He's died, and now he's been buried. That's the last thing we looked at the end of that chapter. He's buried by Joseph of Arimathea, and then they place guards at the tomb. And one thing, we pointed this out last week, and I'll mention it again. Matthew is sure to show us these various eyewitnesses throughout much of these things that are taking place. Everything that happens, there's someone there to witness it, if not multiple people. And so, for example, when we see Jesus die, and there are these miraculous signs that happen, the veil of the temple's torn in two, and there's the earthquake, and the graves are open, and so on. And we see there that in verse 54, the centurion and those who were with him, they saw this, and they glorified God afterward, where it says that they were keeping watch over Jesus, they saw the earthquake and what took place, and they were filled with awe and said, truly this was the Son of God. And then in the very next verse, in verse 55, there are also these women. They'd been with Jesus all the way from Galilee to this point. So they've been with Jesus ever since he left Galilee and came to Jerusalem. And they have seen all of it too. And these women, they saw him die. And two of these women, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, they also see Jesus when he's buried in the tomb. We read that in verse 61 of Matthew 27. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there sitting opposite the tomb. Of course, Joseph of Arimathea is a witness. Later on, there are these guards that go to the tomb. They're put there by the Jews. They are witnesses of the sealed tomb. They themselves go and they seal the tomb. We read that in verse 66. They went and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone and setting a guard. So there are all these witnesses here. They've seen all these things taking shape. And what this tells us, it's like what we read in the book of Acts. These things don't happen in a corner. These things are public, and these things are seen by other people. And what we began to see taking shape at the end of the last chapter, and it will become more manifest here in chapter 28, there are two narratives that are beginning to unfold here. And this is especially important when you keep in mind Matthew's initial audience. They're Jews in the first century, and they have to come to the decision, am I going to stay in Judaism, or am I going to be a follower of Christ? And so there are the two narratives that are unfolding. One is a Jewish narrative, the official story from the Jews, and then there is the Christian narrative. Which one's more reliable? Which one am I going to believe? Which one am I going to put my faith in? This is what Matthew's readers have to come to grips with. And we'll see that especially take shape here in chapter 28. Before we read, there are some points of emphasis that I want to bring to your attention on the front end so that you can notice these things as we read this section together. Lord willing, we'll read the first 15 verses of this chapter here this morning. And so there are some points of emphasis here that I just want to bring to your attention. For example, in these 15 verses of Matthew 28, the word either see or behold is used 9 times. And depending on the version you have, it may be more or less. But if you look at the original language, words that are translated either as see or behold are used 9 times. In particular, the word behold is used several times, sort of as a marker of transition to point from one story to the next, and behold, this happens, and behold, this happens. That's something that Matthew is evidently doing a lot here in this section. But we see that this is used 9 times here. And what this is showing us is, again, Matthew's emphasizing the eyewitness testimony here. These are things that have been seen. These are things that can be attested to. These are things that are reliable. Another interesting point of emphasis here is the word go, or like language, like going or coming or what have you. And these words are used 11 times in these 15 verses. And in particular, they're used 9 times after they find the empty tomb. This is telling us the call that one has after seeing the empty tomb. In light of the empty tomb, what do? We go, and then we tell. The word tell is used 6 times in this section, all of which are from verse 7 onward. This is after after the tomb's been found empty. This is the angel is appearing to the women, and so on and so forth. And so what these words are emphasizing is, on the one hand, the reality of the resurrection. You can testify that it truly did happen. It's reliable. And also the reaction of the resurrection. One thing we're going to see in this section are there are 2 different reactions to the news of the empty tomb and the resurrected Jesus. How will we react? That's a question that we ask introspectively, that we ask of ourselves. And so we see the reality and the reaction to the resurrection here in this section. And so with that, let's start by reading the first 7 verses where the women find the tomb empty. So Matthew 28, starting in verse 1, it says, "Now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. And for fear of him the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, 'Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He's not here, for he has risen, as he said. Come, see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead. And behold, he's going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. See, I have told you.'" So they find the tomb empty. Notice that all of this takes place in Matthew's wording, as the English Standard puts it, toward the dawn of the first day of the week. The timeline of this is interesting, and if we have time at the end, I'll say a little more about that in terms of what day these things happen and so on and so forth. There's debate as to what day of the week Jesus would have died and what day he would have been buried. Some will say it was, the traditional view is it's Friday. Some say it could be as early as Wednesday. One thing is certain. They find the empty tomb on the first day of the week, on Sunday, and it's toward the dawn of that. And so what we see in this is the women are going to see the tomb as the sun is rising. There's confusion, and part of this is on our own part because we don't understand how the Jewish days and how their calendar works. Their days begin at sunset. So their days actually sort of begin the day before or the night before. Well, here Matthew clarifies for us, this isn't the night before, but this is toward the dawn. That's the sun rising up. And so this is what we would think of as a morning. And so we see Mary and Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, and they are going to see the tomb. Here Matthew explicitly tells us that is the purpose for them going, is to see the tomb. Unbeknownst to them, I don't think there's any way that they could have known this, they will be the first ones to see the empty tomb, and also later to see the resurrected Christ himself. Jesus will appear to them first. Then he tells them to go to Galilee and so on and so forth. And again, Matthew does a great job of showing us that these things have been beheld by other people. They also had witnessed Jesus' death, and they also witnessed Jesus' burial, these 2 women. So these 2 women have been there for the entirety of what you would say is the gospel. Jesus' death, his burial, and now, of course, his resurrection. And he appears to them. And so they have seen all of this. So these women are these credible witnesses. And it's fitting that there are 2 of them, because under the Jewish law, for testimony to be credible, you had to have at least 2 witnesses. This is something we see woven throughout Matthew's gospel account, and we'll even see more of it here in this section. So Mary and Mary go to the tomb. And many have questioned, why would you visit the tomb? There are various reasons, perhaps, as to why. Other gospel accounts say that they were going to do things with spices for Jesus' body and so on and so forth. There are various reasons. You could ask the question, well, you have a loved one who is buried and has a cemetery plot somewhere. Why do you go to see them? You go to pay respects, whatever. So it could be something along those lines. Maybe they're anticipating it being empty, as Jesus said. Have we thought of that? Jesus, he said this over and over again. They're going to kill me, but on that third day I will be raised from the dead. Maybe they're more faithful than Jesus' own disciples are. Maybe that's part of this. There's something else perhaps that's going on here. There's a Jewish tradition, and you can read of this in the Talmud, which is the Jewish traditional writings. And in the Talmud, it outlines this tradition that they have of visiting graves until the third day. And the reason for that is to make sure that they didn't bury a person who's alive. They wanted to make sure that they were actually dead. And it's not like we think of where you stick someone in a casket and you put them in the ground, and if they're alive, then they're going to die in there. That may not necessarily be the case for someone who's put in a grave that's been dug out of a rock or what have you, or in a cave. They're not going to necessarily suffocate. Now, they might suffocate after a few days, but they're not going to suffocate right away. And so this is perhaps why, and they would quit that after 3 days, because after 3 days, the person is presumably going to be dead by then. You can kind of see a little bit of this in Jesus raising Lazarus. Jesus goes to his tomb on the 4th day. And they say, oh, you don't want to go. He's for sure dead. It's been 4 days. He's going to stink. The body had already began to decompose, as we see there. And perhaps this is what's going on. And if this is the case, then one commentator puts it this way. If they're going to confirm that Jesus is dead, just to make sure, this commentator says, the women who come, surely with sadness, to confirm Jesus' death, become, with great joy, the first witnesses to his resurrection. Perhaps they went to confirm his death, but what they have actually done is confirmed his resurrection through their eyewitness testimony. So they come to the tomb, and upon coming to the tomb, in verse 2, the women, they see something that is nothing short of spectacular. And we looked previously with the things that happened upon Jesus' death, the earthquake and the empty graves. Some of that happened then foreshadows what we read here in chapter 28. Here there's another earthquake, just as it had happened upon Jesus' death. So there is here in verse 2, an earthquake happens. And what's interesting, I'll read verse 2 again. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. The word "for" there shows us the reason why the earthquake happened. It denotes the purpose. The reason why that earthquake happens is because of this angel. The angel is the source of this earthquake. There was an earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended. So the angel of the Lord has caused this earthquake to happen. And he comes, he rolls the stone away, and he sits on it. And so again, he rolls back the stone that once sealed the tomb. Chapter 27 ends with them sealing the tomb. That presumably would have been the end of the story in most other cases, but this is not most other cases, because Jesus has risen from the dead. And again, we see that he rolls back the stone. Well, that might make you wonder why. Because presumably he rolls the stone away and Jesus is already gone. The answer then would be so that the others could look in and also see that empty tomb. They don't have to guess. They can look in and see, oh, this tomb really is empty. And again, they are seeing it. They are eyewitnesses of it. And so they see the earthquake, the angel comes, the angel rolls the stone away, and the angel is sitting on that stone. That's spectacular in and of itself. But also the angel's appearance is spectacular. We read in verse 3, his appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. A lot of this is echoing language from the Old Testament, like in the book of Daniel, for example. There's some language used there in Daniel 7 and in Daniel 10 pertaining to angels, and a lot of that fits what we read here. But what we see here, this showcases the obvious splendor and holiness that this angel has. And it even reminds us somewhat of the transfigured Jesus in Matthew 17. James and Peter and John are on the Mount of Transfiguration with Jesus. His appearance changes. That's what the word transfigured means. His figure has changed. And this angel now reminds us of that. That's something that would be reminiscent to Matthew's readers. We come to verse 4, and interestingly, we find out the women are not the only ones there. Remember at the end of chapter 27 that they set a guard. So there are guards there as well. We don't know how many there are. There's multiple guards there. But we know that there is a guard there. Those who had been guarding the tomb, remember, to make sure that Jesus' disciples didn't come and take the body, that's what the Jews were afraid of, they are there also, and they also have seen what's happening. So here we have another witness, another set of witnesses. The women are there, and these guards are there. And what we're going to see happen is these two sets of witnesses, you have the women and you have the guards, they really couldn't be any more different in terms of not just who they are, but in terms of how they react as well. And so this is part of the dualistic significance of what Matthew is drawing out here. The women will react one way, the guards will react a different way. And how they react is they show great fear, it says. And for fear of him, the guards trembled. Trembling is an involuntary response. It's not something you can necessarily do on command. It's something that you do because of great fear. And it's not reverent fear, but it's terrifying fear. They tremble, and it says that they became like dead men, which is ironic because they're at a tomb. There's supposed to be a dead person inside the tomb, but he's not there. Instead, these people on the outside become like dead men. It's very ironic. And then we see in verse 5 the angel begin to address the women. He starts by telling them, do not be afraid. You see this frequently in terms of angelic appearances. The theological term would be an angelophany. A theophany is an encounter with God. Well, an angelophany would be an encounter with an angel. You don't have to know that. That's not going to be on the test. But he tells them to not be afraid. And this is common in angelic encounters. You could look, for example, in Genesis chapter 21, if you want an example from the Old Testament. In Genesis 21, this is when Isaac is born, and you have the dynamic between Hagar and Ishmael with Isaac being born and all of that. And in Genesis 21, an angel appears before Hagar, and it says there in Genesis 21 and verse 17, God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. So the assurance to fear not, you see that here in Genesis 21. And in Luke 1, when we read, I think this is the telling of the birth of John the Baptizer. I could be wrong on that. In Luke 1 and verse 13, an angel appears here. Yeah, this is pertaining to John the Baptizer. An angel appears to Zechariah, John's father, and the angel says, do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. So we see this here in multiple examples. This is a frequent thing when you have these angelic encounters. I don't know why that is. Some people say that the angels would have looked terrifying. Perhaps that's true. Perhaps the sequence of events is enough to invoke great fear. But one thing that's interesting, there's no mention of the women's fear until we get to verse 8 when they're leaving. In verse 8 it says, as they're leaving, they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy. So there's no mention of the women being afraid until verse 8. Perhaps their faces said it, and Matthew doesn't. But it's an interesting thing to point out. So he tells them first, do not be afraid. And next he mentions that he knows why they're there. Here we see some divine given foreknowledge to this angel. He knows why they're there. I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. This is why they're there. It's interesting, Matthew tells us initially they're there to see the tomb. Here the angel says, no, you're here to see Jesus. This is why you're here. Perhaps whether they realize it or not, this is why they're here. And what we see taking shape here is in making this initial statement, you came to see Jesus who was crucified. What we see here is the beginning, and it'll be culminated with the rest of what the angel says. This is the beginning of a great statement of faith. He's begun what you could call the great confession of Jesus' death and his resurrection. Jesus was crucified, but he's been raised from the dead. And this coincides, of course, with Paul's words in 1 Corinthians 15. When you think about the gospel itself, it's the good news of the death, burial, resurrection, and appearing of Jesus. So he begins to share the good news. And he continues in verse 6. He is not here, for he has risen as he said. Notice he points out the fact that Jesus has said this is going to happen, and we read that in Matthew. Matthew points that out to us at least 3 times. I'm going to go to Jerusalem, I'm going to suffer things, I'm going to be killed, but on that 3rd day I'll be raised. Jesus made mention of that several times, and here it has happened, and the angel confirms it. In this sense, the angel is a witness of this. He gives them the testimony. Jesus is raised from the dead. And with the newly unsealed tomb, he came and he unseals it. He lets them look inside. He says, see the place where they laid him. And so what we see in this is not a baseless claim. He offers proof. Sometimes people, and you see this a lot today, especially in the age of social media, where someone will make a sort of outlandish claim, and you might ask for proof, you might ask for that to be verified, and they say, well, you just got to trust me. We see that all the time. Well, this is not a baseless claim. He offers proof. And they don't even have to ask for it. He offers it before they can even ask. Here, come look. He can show them the empty tomb. And then finally, he gives them the call to go and tell. We pointed out earlier that going and telling are 2 things that are used frequently in this section. We see it here initially. He gives them the call to go and to tell. Specifically, they're called to go and tell his disciples. And in Matthew's account, I know in John is at the crucifixion and all that. We're not doing a study of John. In Matthew, they are absent. They've been absent since Jesus is arrested. Peter looked on from afar, but he was still absent. And as he's absent, he's denying Jesus those 3 times. And so they are still at large at this point. They've been absent. They're going to come back, Lord willing, when we look starting in verse 16 in the next chapter. But they're still absent here. And the angel tells them to go and tell the disciples. And specifically, they're also told to go to Galilee. Keep in mind, they'd been in Jerusalem or in the Judean area, maybe not in the city, but outside of the city. Now they're called to go to Galilee, and Jesus is going to meet them there. And how fitting is it for them to go to Galilee, the place where it all began? That's also where it's all going to end. Then we come to the next little section, verses 8 through 10, where as these women are doing as they're told, Jesus appears before them. So picking up in verse 8, it says, so they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and said, greetings. And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. One thing we see here with these women, not only do they do as they're told, but they don't waste any time. Matthew says that they departed quickly and they ran to tell his disciples. They're not wasting any time here. They are making haste to do this. I would like to think so. I'm not much of a runner, but I'd like to think I would. Yeah. And what we see, they understandably, you can see why, they've got a mixture of emotions here. And you can understand, and we've even seen this in the recent days here, there's a great mixture of emotions going on. And here for these women, they've got fear, which perhaps is reverent fear, or perhaps terrifying fear, or perhaps a combination of both. And they've got joy as well. Jesus did as he said he would. He has risen from the dead. And that, of course, is a joyous thing. But then, as they're going, they see Jesus himself. Jesus meets them. And it's interesting, there's no mention here in Matthew's rendition of this of them not recognizing him or anything along those lines, as you see in some of the other accounts. But they recognize him right away, it seems. And Jesus, he gives them just a simple greeting. In the Greek, the greeting is karate, and that is kind of the Greek equivalent of the Jewish greeting of shalom. And it means greetings or good tidings, or it'd be our equivalent of saying, hey there, or good morning, or what have you. I don't know that you see that here.
In red, it says that in verse 9, and as they went to tell his disciples, behold, Jesus met them, saying, all hail. And they came and held him by the feet and worshipped him.
I don't know if that's just outdated English or if it's just a bad translation. I wouldn't say that, but
King James Version.
Yeah. It might just be outdated English.
I think it's a good way to say it. The actual word is cheerio, probably where we get cheerio, like joy.
Yeah.
And so it's paying tribute to somebody in a positive way.
Okay. So he gives them this greeting. The ESV translated as greetings. Others might say rejoice or something along those lines. We see now, the angel was the first witness. Now Jesus is the second witness to the women about his resurrection. Because all they've seen at this point is the empty tomb. All they know is, okay, Jesus isn't in that tomb. We don't know what happened to him. The angel told them he's risen. Now they see the risen Jesus himself. So now you have the two witnesses for that as well, making it credible. And the women respond appropriately by taking hold of Jesus' feet, which is a humble posture and a humble gesture to bow before him, and they worship him. And the word for worship there is proskuneo. It literally means to bow down before. And this is what they do. This is, when you study the reactions to the news of the risen Christ in the empty tomb, the women are one reaction, the guards are another, and consequently the Jews are another reaction. The women, which is sort of ironic because they're outcast in terms of a Jewish patriarchal sort of society, they have it right. And then in verse 10, Jesus gives them instructions. He says, don't be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. Jesus' instructions here parallel the instructions of the angel. They're almost word for word the same, with a few minor differences. Like the angel, Jesus tells them, don't be afraid. And again, whether that's terrorizing fear or reverent fear or a little bit of both, we don't know. But Jesus says, don't be afraid. And also, just as the angel says, Jesus gives them the call to go and to tell. This is the call of all Christians, and we'll see that culminated in the next section with what we call the Great Commission, to go and to tell. And that's what Jesus tells them here. Except again, it's initially just to the disciples. He says to go and tell, but instead of disciples, like the angel said to go to his disciples in verse 7. Here he says to go and tell my brothers. I think this tells us something about Jesus. These are the ones who have fallen away. They're nowhere to be found. Peter, in fact, has denied him 3 times. And yet Jesus still calls them his brothers. He says, go and tell my brothers, and I'll meet them there. I think that says something good about Jesus. And so that is one side of the story. And now we begin to see the other side of the story, the other narrative that's taking shape here. You have the Christian way that this happens, which is the reliable eyewitness way. But then you have the Jewish way also. And we read that finally in verses 11 through 15. It It says, while they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers, and said, tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. So they took the money and did as they were directed. And this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. So we see now the opposite side of this. There's the Christian story and there's the Jewish story. And what happens here is, keep in mind, you have those two sets of witnesses. You have the women and you have the guards. The guards, they go into the city and they tell the chief priests, as Matthew puts it, all that had taken place. There's no reason to believe that they would have left anything out here. So what this tells us is the chief priests have the whole story. There's no details that they're missing. So the question then is, how will they react? How are they going to react to the news of the empty tomb and the risen Christ? One thing that's interesting, too, to point out, there's a little bit of a contrast. I don't think I have this in my notes, so I'll make a brief mention of it. In 27, in verse 58, the tombs were opened and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. There you see people who were dead. They go into the city. That's a bit of an interesting thing. It mentions that it's after his resurrection. Well, here, remember, these guards had fallen as if they were dead. And now they go into the city. So there's a little bit of a parallel here between those who came out of the tombs and now these guards. They had fallen as if they were dead. They go into the city and they are telling. What were you going to say, Amos?
His resurrection.
Yeah.
And then it comes back and describes his resurrection in the chapter after that. Just
Yeah.
so it kind of connects the two.
Yeah.
And there's the earthquake and the removal of the tombs, opened tombs, and bodies coming up, as you said. And so, yeah, I wanted to make sure that we have a relationship between these two.
Yeah.
Sometimes
Yeah, after his resurrection, the bodies come to the city. Yeah. So they get the whole story. So how will they react? Well, what they end up doing, they meet with the elders, the chief priests and the elders, two pretty important groups of people. And what they decide to do, it says they take counsel, which means this isn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This is something that they took some thought into. And what they decide is to bribe the guards to lie about what had happened. Matthew tells us what really happened. But here they bribe them to lie. Contrast that with the angels in Jesus. They tell the women to go and tell what had actually happened. Go and tell that Jesus is risen from the dead, he's going to meet you in Galilee, so on and so forth. Well, here the Jews tell the guards to go and tell that his disciples took his body. And so they instead tell the guards to go and tell a lie. And the big lie again is this in verse 13. Tell them that his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. You remember what Matthew had told us in the end of chapter 27, where the Jews go to Pilate. They ask for guards to be placed there because this is what they're afraid of. They're afraid of Jesus' disciples coming and taking his body. Or perhaps they're afraid of Jesus actually being right. Well, Jesus is right, and so now they've got to cover their bases. And what's interesting is Matthew has given us the details of what happened. He gives us the eyewitness testimony. The women are there. The angel testifies to it. Jesus himself is a testimony of it. They see the risen Christ. And so Matthew's details already prove this to be false. They, in fact, didn't come and take Jesus' body. And, in fact, the guards weren't asleep. They saw the whole thing. There's no mention of them sleeping here. And so what this tells us is one side has the truth. They have the eyewitness testimony. The other is a conspiracy. And also, this is self-incriminating. Think about it. What good are guards that are sleeping? they're no good. They can't prevent anything from happening if they're asleep. And so this is self-incriminating on them. And so what the Jews are asking these guards to say is, yeah, we were sleeping, that's our bad. They're asking the guards to turn themselves in, more or less. But there's something interesting that happens in verse 14. Because in verse 14, it says, "And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So kind of the implication of that is, and this is the consequence of lying, you've got to cover your bases, and you've got to cover your bases multiple places. Not only are they willing to bribe the guards, but it's sort of implied that they're willing to bribe the governor as well. It says again, "And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him." That language, that's how the ESV translates it. This insinuates that they'll do whatever it takes to get him happy, even if it means paying him off, which seems like that's what they're implying. And keep in mind who these people are. They are the chief priests. They have control of the money that's flowing in and out of the temple. And so and it's interesting, they didn't want to make any use of Judas's blood money within the treasury. And so they go and they still use it, though. And here they're willing, it's not stated that they're using treasury money for this. You could maybe read in the lines and say that, but they're willing even to pay off the governor. And one interesting detail about this that's interesting, and part of this is knowing the history of the time, they possibly would have needed to pay the governor, because you would wonder, well, why is it that they would even need to pay off the governor? What's wrong with the guards being sleeping and them taking Jesus' body? Well, this was actually a crime to tamper with a tomb. Just like it's a crime today, I believe, to tamper with someone's grave even today. This was a crime back then, and we actually have historical evidence of that. There's a decree from Caesar to this effect, and that we have this decree. It was found on an inscription, and it's commonly called the Nazareth inscription, I think because they found it in Nazareth, although they think it actually originated from a different place. But they found it in what would be Nazareth, and they date this as sometime between 50 BC and 50 AD, so within about a 100-year period. And this is around the time of Jesus' earthly ministry. This is around the time that Jesus was walking the earth and when he would have died and been buried and raised from the dead. So this fits with the timeline of what's going on here. And so this is a law that was on the books, that if you violated a tomb, then that was a crime, and it was punishable even by death. And so this is why this matters. Because now, these guards, and being willing to say, yeah, we fell asleep and we let them do this, the penalty then is going to fall on them for what happens. And this is consistent with what we see in how society worked back then, is if someone gets away with a crime, the ones who let them get away are the ones who face the punishment. And so if the guards allowed for the tomb of Jesus to be violated, which is what they're saying is what happened, they fell asleep is going to be their story, they would have been the ones then who would have faced this punishment from Rome. They would have been the ones who were complicit in the tomb being violated, if that is what happened, which of course it's not. But they then would have faced this punishment. And what we see here, the chief priests are going to make sure that that doesn't happen. They'll do whatever it takes to satisfy the governor and to make sure that they're taken care of for their part in the lie. And so despite the risk of this, their necks are on the line here. Despite the risk, we see that the guards accept the bribe. It says they took the money and they did as they were directed. In this way, they parallel the women. The women do as they're told. We see that they are doing so quickly, and they're not wasting any time. And these guards are also doing as they're directed. In this case, they parallel each other, but of course they're different in what they're told to do. The women are told to tell the truth. The guards are told to lie. And so with that, you have the two explanations for the empty tomb. And as Matthew tells us, this story, the story of Jesus' disciples coming and taking his body while they were asleep, this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. And this is even a common theory you hear by people today. There are various theories that could explain the empty tomb. Well, maybe Jesus never died in the first place. No, we've got witnesses that saw him die. Well, maybe they never put him in the tomb. No, we've got witnesses that testify to that too. The women are there when they bury him. Well, maybe his disciples came and took him. No, we've got witnesses that discredit that as well. But that's the story that they were spreading even to that day, as Matthew's writing this, that the disciples had come and taken Jesus' body away. And so you see the importance of the eyewitness testimony. People who saw it with their eyes and are willing to testify to it, and even in some cases they're willing to die for it. This makes it, of course, all the more credible. And so, if you're Matthew's initial audience, if you're a Jew living in the first century and you've been a practicer of Judaism your whole life, but you're thinking of maybe following this Jesus of Nazareth guy, which of these stories would be more believable? Which is more credible? Well, one story has multiple eyewitnesses. They've got the two witnesses or more. They've got that and then some, especially after Jesus appears to the disciples, especially after the miracles accompany what the apostles are able to do. We read of that in the book of Acts and so on and so forth. And so there's already multiple eyewitnesses. There are soon to be more. They can back up the Christian narrative of this, that Jesus did in fact raise from the dead. But then you have the other story, and as Matthew gives us the insight here, this story was devised in a private gathering. Instead of being beheld by eyewitnesses, this one was thought out and conspired by the chief priests and the elders. One thing that they cannot and do not deny is the fact that the tomb is empty. So which story will you believe? We've got a couple minutes, so I'm going to explain the ideas behind the sequence of events pertaining to the days of the week and so on and so forth, pertaining to what day Jesus was killed and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of debate about the timeline of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. The traditional view, we have a holiday on our calendar called Good Friday, and that commemorates the day that Jesus died. And so the traditional view is he died on Friday and he rose on Sunday. But what about Jesus' words in Matthew 12 and verse 40? This, if you remember, is when the Jewish leaders come and they ask for a sign. And Jesus says there's not going to be a sign that's given except the sign of Jonah. And this is what he says, "For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth." And so these two parallel each other in the sense of 3 days and 3 nights. Jonah was in the belly of the fish. Jesus is going to be in the belly of the earth, more or less. And so that raises the question, well, that doesn't seem to line up with the traditional view if Jesus died on Friday. Because that's not 3 days and 3 nights. That's maybe 1 full day at the most. So how do we reconcile this? There's some insights that I think are interesting to point out. One, we get this from John 19. This is in John's narrative of the death of Jesus and so on. And it says, "Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath," and John tells us that that Sabbath was a high day. That tells us that this isn't an ordinary Sabbath. And this coincides with the feast that the Jews were getting ready to celebrate, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. You have the Passover, you have the feast, and so on and so forth. And so what this seems to be implying is that this Sabbath, the Sabbath that they were trying to avoid keeping Jesus on the cross for, this is the Sabbath the day after Jesus' death. John tells us that this is a high Sabbath, and the implication of that is it pertains to the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Based on the Jewish calendar, this always takes place on a certain day on the calendar, and it's always the 15th of Nisan, which if you go back and you look at the year that Jesus is traditionally thought of as being killed, 30 AD, It used to be 33 AD, but they think they got it wrong, and they moved it back 3 years. If you're used to hearing 33, that's why. But in 30 AD, that falls on a Thursday on our calendar. And so just mapping out when this would have taken place, this is their traditional view. That's the Sabbath that was talked about. He would have been dead and buried on Friday, raised on Sunday, the first day of the week. We know that that's true because Matthew tells us that. But then you have an earlier view. That's day 1, 2, and 3. This is the earlier view where you have this high Sabbath that on that year would have been on a Thursday, which would then put Jesus' death and burial on Wednesday, raised on Sunday, and then you have day 1, night 1, day 2, night 2, day 3, night 3. Then he's raised after that. This coincides with what Jesus said pertaining to the sign of Jonah. I'll let you be the judge. Any comments or questions?
Nick,
Yeah.
I had this discussion recently with my brother, and he spent a year in Beirut, Lebanon, and in the Arab world to this day, and the Jewish world as well, if you travel on a Friday, maybe you traveled a couple hours, you traveled a day. They count that as a whole day. Mm-hmm. That was his explanation for the traditional view. But the other view is pretty compelling as well. I just thought I'd throw that out there. That,
Yeah.
you know, if so say Jesus did die the traditional on Friday, they would count that as a whole day,
Yeah.
fitting in with what Jesus said with Jonah. But I don't know. Is that what we're to understand the material? You know, that we read about in the New Testament. I don't know. Anyway.
And to that point, I don't think it's of much consequence, but it's interesting to think about, and it's interesting to think about what Jesus would have meant in terms of explaining the sign of Jonah and so on and so forth. So it's interesting, and I think it is compelling. All right, thanks.